in the Middle East in the last 4 or 5 months. We have witnessed a number of countries that were receiving millions of tourists as a way of bringing foreign exchange for the government and as a way of livelihoods for the people who work in the value chain of tourism. That a country can also be very vulnerable to a crisis, whether it's a political crisis, whether it's a natural crisis. Of course, after the tsunami in Thailand, the earthquake in Pakistan, uprising in Egypt and Tunisia, it has become clear that some countries' economic well-being become more vulnerable if their economies rely heavily on tourism inflows. So a crisis can seriously reduce foreign exchange reserves for a government, drive down the value of its currency, and adversely affect the lives of people who work in the value chain, as we say. For that reason, we thought we should have a session here and we should bring around the table the players such as the UNWTO, UN World Trade Organization, and also the ILO, International Labour Organization, as well as the ITC, which really focuses on exports to talk about this and come out with some solutions. For this, we have found a moderator who has quite a bit of experience also from the developing country side. Mr. Musa Umaru, who is a director at the ILO, a department that's called Dialogue, Social Dialogue, is a former Secretary General of Ministry of Education, National Education in Niger, and also he's a former Minister of Labor and Employment and Public Service in Niger. Now he's at the ILO. He has kindly accepted to moderate this session. He is going to introduce the other participants, and I will let the floor to Mr. Umaru at this point. Thank you.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me and also a challenge for me to moderate this session for 2 reasons. The first is that I have to moderate the session, this panel in English, and English is not my usual language, so that I have to apologize for the quality of my English. And as I said, I promise that for the 5th LDC forum, I'll improve my English. So the second challenge is that tourism is not my specialty. But I'm from LDC country, and in my country and in my professional experience, I used to face with some crises, political crises and other shocks. So it will be very interesting for me to see the exchange between the panelists and the discussion with the participants, and this certainly will be a very good thing for me. But in my daily work in ILO, I deal with social dialogue. I deal with dialogue. I deal with tripartite discussions, and I deal to bring together tripartite actors, workers' organizations, employers' organizations, and government, to bring them together, to work together and to face the situation and to have solutions to get social peace. So I think that as one of the components of the subject is crisis, so maybe social dialogue may be one of the solutions, certainly. So as my English is very weak, I don't want to massacre the English. So I just want to introduce the panelists. We have 6 panelists. The first is on the right, Madame Hala El Khatim. She is from Egypt. She is the Secretary General of the Ministry of Tourism. The second panelist is Mr. Hiran Kurai. He is from Sri Lanka, and he's a businessman. His business is transport. We have also Mr. Martin Roche. Mr. Martin Roche is from Etoile, and he said he also speaks very bad English because he's Scottish. This is him. We have Dr. Cliff Glaser, who is Dr. Cliff Glaser, who is the Chief of Risk and Crisis Management. We have Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole is from UNWTO, I think. So, if you agree, I will give the floor to Mrs. Halal. The agreement is that every panelist have 5 minutes to go directly straight to on the subject, and after this we'll have a plenary discussions, and I'll give the floor to our colleague on the left wing to have a kind of synthesis. This is the introduction I will have to do. So, Madam Al-Khalali.
Thank you very much. In English, my name is Hala Al-Khatib, and I'm the Secretary General of the Egyptian Hotel Association, but previously, as Musa mentioned, I was the media advisor to the Minister and of Tourism, and unfortunately, or fortunately, the head of the Crisis Management Unit. And I always ask myself, am I fortunate or unfortunate to have this kind of experience? Anyway, I was fortunate to have been able to manage crisis that Egypt has faced. We, except for natural disasters, we have had it all. Name it: terrorism, swine flu, avian flu, name it. It's always been there. In 2004, when I just joined the ministry, and right after the Taba bombings that took place in October, we realized, having been away from the ministry before, that there has never been a manual or a guide or a center to manage a crisis. And that the former minister was the only one to have dealt with the crisis before. Although he did a wonderful job, but it was haphazardly done. There was no system. He did a good job, but when things are not planned properly, things could happen like this, what happened in Egypt, which I'll tell you about. During the 1997 Luxor incident, or as known in the media as Luxor massacre, the CNN News started the headlines by saying 58 tourists were killed in Hatshepsut temple in Luxor. Other headlines went on, and then there was a commercial break where the temple of Hatshepsut was seen on television with a big slogan saying, "Egypt, I wish I was in Egypt." And this was really ridiculous, and it happened because there was no planning. There was no manual. There was no one who knows that he or she is the person who should call the PR agency or the marketing agency and tell CNN to stop the advertisement or the commercial. And of course, due to the time differences, and when they realized that this is happening, it took them at that time two days to stop the commercial. And every time on the headline, Egypt was mentioned, as the massacre in Luxor was said, and later the slogan, "I wish I was in Egypt." So things like that, we have learned that the only way to avoid is to have a proper planning. I would like to share with you today what I learned, and this will depend on your questions. I don't want to consume all the 5 minutes or more. So I would like to share with you more of practical experience. What happens when a crisis happens? How can you be prepared? Who does not come or stop travel? Which segment of the tourists that do not come? Which is more important to a tourist? or more preferred? Is it visible or invisible security? How can you realize that you are out of the crisis, or the crisis is still happening? I will be happy to be here today and answer all of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hala, for this brief and interesting introduction to the debate. So I'll give the floor to Mr. Hiran Khore.
Thank you, Mr. When I look around the table, I think basically I have nothing to say because all of you are experienced practitioners in tourism, and these things do happen. And listening to the lady from Egypt also tells us that one thing that I can be very certain is that no crisis is the same. I mean, we went through, as I was saying in the morning, 25 years of crisis. I mean, when we thought everything was over, the tsunami hit us. I mean, so for us it was man-made disasters as well as the natural disasters. So it was always a case of learning what to do. And some of the things that I learned, I mean, I don't know whether it is an Asian phenomenon, Sri Lankan phenomenon, or is it global, that most political leaders, when some disaster happens, don't want to come out. I mean, I remember in 2001, July 24th, this was before 9/11, 2001, when the LTT, the Sri Lankan terrorists, attacked the Sri Lanka airport, and they bombed 4 of our airplanes. They just destroyed 4 aircraft. Another thing that we learned was to have patience. When you have such disasters, you can't have instant changeover, makeover. I mean, you have to allow it to simmer, you have to allow things to settle down and take action. You have to also see what the media are saying. I mean, sometimes, as she was quite rightly saying, sometimes the media might get the wrong end of the stick, and so you need to handle the mainstream media, and that's a very difficult one because they are obviously not going to believe the government or the industry associations when we come out and issue a statement. They are only going to rely on their sources. So these are frustrating times for us. And also another thing that we learned was never try to solve your problem on your own. I mean, there is help outside. There are people who love your country, who are passionately involved in the country. Use them as well when some disaster happens, because sometimes everybody says, oh no, I can fix it, I know what to do with it, but it never works. So it's always good to get the help of the others and watch what the others are saying and use them to assist in every way possible. So those are some of the things that we learned, and thankfully, even especially after the tsunami, we felt we were never alone. There was so much of help that came our way, and that helped us to get over the situation faster than we expected. That's basically what I'd like to say, and we'll continue with the rest of the.
Thank you, Hiran. Now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Martin Rowe.
Hiran said he didn't have very much to say. I have a huge amount to say, but don't worry, I've ordered breakfast for us all. Just picking up on what he said, one of the, I think, the really, really important things is to plan. In many cases with natural disasters, most countries know the type of natural disasters they're going to face, and many have put in the technical circuitry, the technical infrastructure to deal with that. But I suspect that rarely are the communications people for the government, and sometimes for large tourism operators, integrated into that process. One of the things I learned working with Hilton after the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, when we reviewed the worldwide crisis management, was that crisis management manuals were on the whole useless because they were far too long and nobody read them. And there was certainly, when a crisis hit, nobody had any time to refer to them. and they weren't updated, and people didn't carry out rehearsals and reviews, and this is absolutely essential to integrate this into your planning, not only because you'll just be better at doing it, but because of the tremendously important emotional impact you can have around the world by appearing to be in charge, that you have a grip of the situation. And that's tremendously important, obviously, to people within a country, but also to your markets worldwide, and to your investors worldwide, and to your fellow members of the international community. If you look as if you're in charge and you know what you're doing and you've got systems under control, this is a huge advantage, I think, to you. One of the things that struck me about today is that there's a vast amount of expertise here. There are people who know how to run airlines, run hotels, run national, international tourism programs, there are PR people, there are marketing people, there are advertising people. But I think we may be missing something in that there aren't any journalists here who are not reporting. And I think it would be enormously helpful and perhaps through the various organisations involved. This is not to try and restrain journalists from doing their job, but to get journalists to try and understand the size of the issue that countries often face when faced with difficulties, but also, even more importantly from your point of view, to learn from them. What pressures are they under? What is it you need to do to help you get messages through them? And this is not about, to use an English phrase, gilding the lily. This is not about exaggerating the position you're in. This is about realistically bringing them into your confidence. And my experience as a former journalist, but also my experience in PR over many years, is if you tell the truth, you get a much better result in the long term. If you say, look, we've got real difficulties here, we've got real problems, but this is what we're doing to solve it, you become much, much more credible, and you need that third-party endorsement. You need everybody in the world to help you, but if you can get Le Monde or the Sunday Times or BBC or NBC or whoever it might be, these respected international media, to write not necessarily favourably about you, but honestly about you, they will begin to come back and write your story. But you can't stop telling it. You've got to go on telling it for years. And you've got to give, to use a brand phrase, you have to give people permission to believe. So that means you have to tell them lots and lots and lots of stories. And if there's one other piece of advice, then I'll shut up. There's 1,000 other things I'd love to say. In the last 2 or 3 years, the internet has become television. And of course we see leading broadcasters around the world doing this fantastically well. This is within the grasp of every country in the world with some professional advice and help to create internet television on a daily basis, particularly countries recovering from either political or disaster, to create and use live, credible television, because that's your media. This is the media where you can play the agenda. And the most fascinating thing I remember 10 years ago, if you asked a journalist what was his biggest source of reference, he would tell you it was the telephone book. And the City University in London did a piece of research last year, and they asked journalists, what's your first point of reference? And 98% said the internet. So you've got this tremendous tool. But it's not just about using it professionally, it's about getting the tone of voice right, it's getting the language right, it's making every single word, not just inform people, but persuade people. You have to persuade people that things are happening, and that means getting them permission to believe.
Okay, thank you for your introduction. Now the floor is for Dr. Dick Glasser.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A long day for all of you, definitely, and many things said before. So how can I be funny without a PowerPoint? That's a core challenge right now. Let me start by being really boring and a real academic. What is the tourism product in academic terms? And I want to bore you with this concept because I do believe that there lays the foundation for plenty of answers when it comes to communicating about the tourism product. The tourism product is produced in the future. Boring sentence number one. Boring sentence number two is it's produced away from the place where you buy them. Third, there's predominantly a service product. If something happens to the tourism product, different to a water bottle, you can't touch it, you can't verify it, you can't look at it. That's why we say in information economic terms, it is a trust and belief product. And that is the most complicated product you can deal with. So when it comes to exportation, yes, it is definitely, as we learned throughout the whole day today, definitely the way to go for LDCs and to push economic development. But at the same time, bear in mind, it is a trust and belief product. And this is especially relevant when it comes to crisis. Sustainable growth is very difficult in an area where we say the tourism sector is a canary in the coal mine. It's the first sector to be affected when something goes wrong. Other sectors look at us and say, look, the tourism sector is hit. We have to pull out. We are serving as an indicator for others. So that means two core rules. We have to look at diversification in the country where we are using tourism as an economic activity. And second of all, we have to know what we are doing in terms of crisis management. Risk and crisis management is, for those development strategies, very important to ensure what we were reminded the whole morning. Throughout the sessions we heard, we don't want tourism, we want sustainable tourism. We want sustainable growth. And then another dominating issue was going throughout the discussions. It was the perception. The perception of there is a situation which is good enough for me to go there. It's safe enough. I think the best quote from this morning was a peace of mind. I want to be at peace when I'm traveling to this destination. So that means what counts for us is the perception of those who are coming, whether this is domestic tourism or international tourism. The peace of mind, the perception, that counts. We cannot force anybody into tourism into any destination, but we have to deal with it. So here comes right now a core challenge. How can we deal with good crisis management systems in countries? We have to integrate travel and tourism, the needs of travel and tourism, properly into the emergency structures. That's number one. And we have to know how, at the Ministry of Tourism, we are dealing with perception crisis and the other issues. Second of all, and here comes where I built the bridge to my colleague and dear friend Dexter Cole, we have to consider the issue of communications. Communications at the international level, coordination of messaging is very important. And here I referred to something we were building up, Jeffrey, the Tourism Emergency Response Network, a global network which we activated several times over the past years, where leading associations like PATA, WTTC, and other global players from the private sector, as well as the UN family, are coordinating extremely quickly and behind closed doors when it comes to global crisis, exchanging information, agreeing on messaging, and in that sense avoiding unnecessary repercussions on the tourism sector. It is often not that somebody wants to do harm to travel and tourism. It is that those are stepping forward who don't understand fully the dimensions of tourism, and that way make difficult statements, difficult for our sector. Here now the bridge. We realize that everybody agrees on crisis communications is important. But what we also saw was that those who are affected by it are normally, although they might have agreed before, unprepared. So that's where we started, and Dexter Cole was assigned then, after a global tender, the work of preparing a crisis communications toolkit with a core and single aim to support those affected destinations and private business during the first 48 hours. 48 hours of not making mistakes. by supporting them with templates, with guidance as simple as that they can take it from the bookshelf to be on the safe side, not to make mistakes, while they are then searching for professional help and setting up the systems to avoid that major damage is done. So here, Mr. Chair, I end and
Yes.
prepare the floor.
Thank you for the transition. The floor is to Dr. Dexter Hall.
I wish I were a doctor.
Yeah.
And I also wish I had the toolbox Dirk is talking about when 30 years ago I had to handle communications for the evacuation center for the 3 Mile Island nuclear disaster, or 10 years ago when I had to handle communications for the U.S. travel industry in Washington, D.C. on 9/11. It would have made my life a lot easier. I'm actually only 25 years old, but it aged me dramatically. I'm just going to talk about the toolbox itself, and I've had the privilege of working with you and WTO and Dirk and the wonderful staff in Madrid to put together this document, which is only a few months away from completion. I can break it out into several parts, but I'll just give you an overview of it very quickly. The first section deals with preparing and training for a crisis. All of the elements of this manual, of this toolbox, are pragmatic, they're logical, they're available and ready for immediate use. They are templates. In that first section of preparing and training, there's how to develop crisis communications policy, crisis management team and responsibilities, so you'll know immediately who's in charge and what the chain of command is. Crisis communications team and responsibilities. You'll know who speaks and who doesn't. Staffing procedures, identifying key audiences, media access policy, not just the policy itself. Obviously, spokesperson training and things that you can do in advance. Fact-finding, the all-important victim notification policy and procedures, so you know what to do immediately if there are victims, and there are always victims, unfortunately. And finally, also, step-by-step measuring results. That's the first section. The second section is something that would not have occurred to me in my previous crisis situations, and that is timing is critical, and it's social media. We talked about dealing with the media. Well, yes, that's important. We do have to deal with the traditional media in crisis. But the media now is different than it was 2 weeks ago or 6 months ago. You're dealing with social networking. People on site who immediately take out their iPhone, take a photo, email it to friends, and within minutes, it's all around the world. It bypasses, and in fact, the CNNs and BBCs and Al Jazeera's, they pick up information from those social networks and broadcast it. That's a source of their information. So you have to move immediately. Well, the second section of the toolbox, crisis communications toolbox, deals with social networking. How do you handle that? Do you understand it? Step by step, all the way through, what the limitations are, what you should do, how you should be prepared. The final section is the tools, and those are the templates. And you can pull one out at a time, from developing your mission statement, your position statement, things that are fairly mundane that you'd have to have, but you'll have to have a holding and standby statement right away, prepared statement with key messages, press releases, and this will have almost 24 press releases for different situations, from tsunamis to earthquakes to terrorism to H1N1, you name it. Human, health, and natural disasters, all three of those categories. Templates for organizational fact sheets for your organization, Q&A, talking point guidelines, media briefing, media interview guidelines, employee procedures checklist. I'm just running down these and then I will wrap up. Victim procedures checklist and statements. They're all right there. You fill in the names. customer communications, employee procedures checklist. I mentioned supplier communications. We forget suppliers in a crisis. Travel industry communications, which is broader. Obviously, website, which is key. How you handle that and what the templates are for that. And travel advisory response. You will immediately be faced with travel advisories from other countries as a template for how you would respond to that to try to mitigate the impact. And finally, a travel industry impact statement. Those are the three key sections. And at the very end, there will be 10 best practices. And when I say best practices, it's actually best practices and lessons learned. There are, in my country, when Hurricane Katrina happened, there was a total breakdown of internal communications because it was centered in the area that was flooded. That's a lesson learned, that's not a best practice, believe me, but they're wonderful best practices represented by several countries in this room. So that is what the crisis communications toolbox is. I emphasize again, it's very practical, it's immediate, it's logical. It will get you through, as Dirk said, the first 48 hours. Then you could be in touch with your PR consultancy. If they're not immediately available, by all means, rely on them. But in this day and age of social networking, you have maybe an hour or two. You don't have a day or two. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. Thank you for all the panelists. What I would like to add, what I would like to put in the basket before the general discussion is that we have to think about the actors. What I mean is that the tourism sector, you have three main actors: the government, the trade unions of tourism sector, and the employers organization, the enterprise, tourism enterprise organization. So that in the case of crisis, during the crisis and after the crisis, they have to be involved and they have the most important role to play. Sure that communication is very important because tourism is a particular sector. Sure that procedures are very important. But on my side, as I'm from ILO, we must have in mind the role of the social partners in the management of the crisis. You know that according to the nature of the crisis, if we have a natural disaster, if we have a political crisis, maybe, this is for the discussion, the response will be different. The management of the crisis will be different. Some minutes ago, I said to Mr. Roche that yesterday night I find that it was very funny. In the same newspaper, I have a communication from the Tunisian government telling that everything is all right in Tunisia and calling people to come back, tourists to come back in Tunisia. But in the same newspaper, I have information coming from press agencies telling that you have roads in Tunisia, you have troubles and strikes in Tunisia. So that, what this means? As I'm from ILO, this means that in this kind of crisis, you need to have social dialogue. Because in Tunisia, and maybe Hala will tell it in Egypt, what we have now, after the political crisis, we have a social crisis with a lot of strikes and workers asking more and more salary improvement. So one of the pillar of tourism the management in a post-crisis situation will maybe social justice. I think that in an agreement we have with UNWTO, this is one of the three pillars we have. So this just my thought in this general discussion, and if you accept, let's go now to the, let's give the floor to the participants.
So I just wanted to,
Yes.
to pick up on a couple of points in this, and we've mentioned all sorts of actors and characters in this, but of course we are talking about recovering from tourism, and we should really talk about tourists, about customers, about clients, and also picking up on what Dexter was saying about social media. But I think that one of the things I'd most encourage you, the single most powerful form of any public relations and any marketing is word of mouth by the customer. We all know this, and there are devastating facts that if you have a bad experience on the whole, you tell 20 people. And if you have a good experience, for some reason you only tell 7. But what I'm suggesting to you is that as tourists begin to come back, those first few hundred, those first few thousand are absolutely critical. And I would invest not just money, but to the highest degree hospitality, and picking up what Musa said, getting your citizens to recognise and understand that they are ambassadors, and getting them to understand that this is a national exercise, and this is about giving people, we were talking earlier on, and the Americans I think understand better than this, than any other people in the world, that we're not in the tourism business, we're in the hospitality business.
Without being honest, are there any actions that we can take proactive before it happens, when you know it is going to happen?
Yes, sure.
I mentioned before briefly something which I call the integration of travel and tourism into the national emergency structures and procedures. Sounds very technical, but it's exactly about that. What we are doing currently is a global review of international travel and tourism, and what we are talking here about is the international dimension of tourism, and then the domestic element of tourism. Travel and tourism needs to be properly integrated into where the challenges are, into the Ministry of Health, into the Ministry of Civil Protection, into the Ministry of Interior, into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Sounds very technical, but they are best practices, and we are compiling this currently, and in September together with Pata we are reviewing it in Australia, and it will be one of the outcomes then later on. What can be done at the national level? Best practices, yeah? National level, regional level, and especially this, what you are tackling right now. How can the private sector properly integrate into the public sector, and the other way around? Because that's what we have seen so many times, that we don't know in a crisis situation what the private sector is capable of doing, and at the same time we don't know what is the public sector and when is he starting to do something. That's in direct answer to that question. And then I wanted to add something to the question you had before. What can the government do in a specific area? Deferred payments. That's definitely a big lessons learned. We have seen all the small and medium-sized enterprises have these tax dates, and they have the biggest problem they have in the crisis situation is cash flow. They don't have guests, but they still have to continue paying. And the best help the public sector can offer the private sector in those times is to defer tax payments. That's what the government of Mexico did in the H1N1 pandemic situation, and the sector was enormously relieved from the pressure. It helped to keep staff. It helped the sector to continue operating. But Hala, you wanted to add?
Joyce, I think Dirk has made the point, but to really get into action, assess the situation, see, ask yourself, what if a crisis happens? What do we have as a private sector or a public sector? What can we do? What if this accident happens? You will realize that you do have to accumulate and compile a great number of information that you should have ready. I'm not talking about a very technical crisis management center or system or manual, but you will realize that there is so much that you could start doing by preparing, by having the numbers of your staff, the phone numbers, What if an accident happens at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, an incident happens? It's a crisis. Who are you going to call? Who is doing what? What if the media asks a question? Do I have a spokesperson? Do I have a number of spokespeople who could speak different languages that I could use? Are they willing to participate? These are the things that you could, because we've been through this, we did not have a center, we did not have a manual, everything was done on one-man show basis. So that's what you could do. Refer to the UNWTO guide on this and the new book, The Policy and Rules. It's very helpful. I urge you to read the steps to get prepared.
Thank you very much. My name is Baguma. I'm from Uganda Tourism Board. And I want to say what I think is a practical situation because currently in Uganda we have gone out of an election. The election was peaceful, but there was a problem with regard to an opposition leader. I think we can even see it globally. And first of all, this is a situation which led to cancellations, a lot of cancellations. And yesterday during a meeting here, someone called me from a media house and he said actually they were in the newsroom writing a story and he was asking me, he said, so far we know that the cancellations are totaling $100 million. What do you have to say about it? Then switches off the phone. And first of all, you don't have time to provide a response to information which you think actually would enhance credibility. Secondly, actually like this week, on Thursday, the new government is being sworn in. And the part of the players, the actors in the crisis, one of them has been out of the country and he's coming back on Wednesday. Now, you are dealing with a backlog regarding cancellations and the losses, and then also there is an impending crisis, which means actually that the crisis is relapsing, it's on and off. Eventually you are at crossroads. What type of strategy can you evolve for a relapsing crisis?
I also wanted to add that in this interim period where the foreign tourist dries out, is there a possibility of activating the internal tourists? In any country, you have a number of people who have the ability and the financial means to travel. They know, they feel better about the security situation after a crisis. They are there, they know that the crisis is over, etc. In order to keep these tourism organizations, the hotels, the employees, the depressed employees going and creating some base cash flow for these organizations, is there part of the strategy to keep, to encourage in Egypt, probably from the 75 or 80 million population, you can encourage 1 or 2 million to move inside the country. Here, I have noticed that the Turks are one of the largest numbers of visitors of their own country in this area. What about this idea?
Okay. Several things. First, I would like to address, if I may say that it's the media will write the story anyway, whether you give them the information or not. So you better voice out what you want to say and make use of the media, because what we don't realize is that at times of crisis, you get more media coverage that you could pay for a long time. And this is why when an incident, a sad incident where there are casualties or victims or people dead, it is advised to clean the site very quickly, because the media will take shots that are emotional, and if there are children affected or so on, it's very good. So always reply to the media. If you are the person who is the spokesperson, then you should have the information. And they will always, bad news sells. They will always go to the dark angle and the negative angle. No one will talk about how beautiful the country is and so on just for nothing. So that's what happens all over the world, by the way. So it is advisable to reply to me. On the other hand, where there are overlapping crises, it is very important to define where is the crisis taking place from your own perspective, but also from a tourist's perspective. Meaning, you have elections, and you have a government, a new government that will come in. If I may suggest that you define geographically where is this taking place, and try to issue in your releases to state that. That means you are separating other parts of the country from the areas that you think there will be a crisis or interruptions or political disturbances. So don't let the media or don't let your people issue the press releases talking about the entire country. No, talk specifically about the geographical, and this is very important. The UNWTO has done a great job on that, I have to say, because we have always suffered from travel advisories. When something happened, a bomb or whatever, you find, for example, the UK or the US or Germany, all those important markets to us, they issue a travel advisory saying it has to be noticed that a bomb has gone, it is advisable not to travel to Egypt. But they managed, and thanks to the UNWTO, to say that this part of Egypt is not safe, but this other part of Egypt is safe. And this is what you need to do. Now, back to the domestic travel. Although domestic travel in Egypt is more expensive than group travel that we are getting from all over the world. So if I go as an Egyptian, I'm a walk-in guest in a hotel, I get more expensive rate than any tourist. But Egyptians, and I think many other countries, do not go on holidays except when there are vacations and schools do not work. So we all go at the same time. We travel as families. We don't have much couples in Egypt. In Egypt, it's families. And I think many of the countries, many of the Arab countries and Turkey and African countries have the same thing. There are no much couples. We don't have couples or newly married that travel and take holiday. We travel as families, and this is the problem. And what we were trying to do is to change the times of public holidays and school holidays in the different governorates, so that tourism, domestic tourism, happens all over the year. But we did not get into a real solution about that. So domestic travel for Egypt never covers or never substitutes the international travel for two reasons. For having the dollar or the euro, we need that, we need the reserves. And the other thing is that we get it all the year. We get tourists from all over the world all the year, not only on vacations. So it could not really substitute it. Plus that only 2 million out of the 80 million people in Egypt travel abroad. So if you convince them to stay, but I think the UK has a better experience in that. And I was talking earlier that during the financial crisis, during the economic crisis, I read that domestic travel has increased in Great Britain by 60%.
Yeah, just a word on that. I mean, one of the issues that you're facing is that when not a lot of things are happening for a set of circumstances, a vacuum is created in the media, and the media will seek to fill that vacuum, and sometimes your opponents and your competitors will seek to fill that vacuum. And the press, if they're presented properly and with well-researched and credible stories, can be persuaded to change their mind, and I've had lots of experience of that over the years. But when you've got this hiatus, when you've got this problem in Uganda at the moment, one of the things that you have to be ready to put into action for any of those circumstances is a bank of good stories. You have to keep your contacts alive with the media. You have to be able to go out to them and say, we know we've got these difficulties, they're getting better, we're getting our political situation sorted out, but look here, we've got 4 great stories for you. Or I've got a devastating fact. Or whatever it is that you have to, you're in competition for stories, you're in competition for facts. And so your facts have to be more credible and more interesting and more stimulating than anybody else's facts. Next that you wanted to do.
I really have nothing to add other than the biggest mistake you could make would be not to respond to the media in your situation. You have to respond immediately, whoever the designated person is. But if you don't know the answer, to maintain your credibility and that of your product in your country, you have to tell them, I don't know the answer, but I will find out for you and give them, I'll find out if there's something statistical. I'll find out and I'll be back to you within 6 hours or 12 hours or 24 hours with the answer to that. But you always need to respond quickly. Maintain that credibility with them.
Just 2 questions from an ignorant of tourism affairs. First is, what could be the importance of a policy in tourism? In a normal situation, in a crisis situation, is the management of the crisis, the post-crisis, the same if a policy is available in the country? This is a question. The second question is that what could be the support of the international cooperation? Myself, I'm from ILO, and I know that ILO have an agreement with UNWTO. And I'm here to reiterate that we are available to a cooperation with UNWTO. Especially, let me insist on this, on how to have a collective agreement in tourism, how to have tools, guides for negotiation, techniques of negotiation, and so on. So we are available, and particularly my department is available for this. These are the 2 comments, questions I have at the end of this session. So if you don't mind, I'll give the floor to Frederick for a kind of synthesis of the discussions. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Musa. And the first lesson I'm taking is that we always should appoint people who pretend not to speak English to moderate sessions, because they do a particularly good job. Let me say at the beginning that I'm really impressed by the quality of the panel. I think the number of the experience with all our favorite crises here is really very impressive. No, I mean that I'm impressed by the number of experience, complete experience that we have chipped in. I'm particularly impressed also by the fact that we have all levels represented: companies, associations, governments, international organizations, and I'm particularly impressed by the work that the UNWTO has been doing in terms of very concrete steps to handle the crisis. Now, I'm in the difficult position to summarize this very rich discussion. So let me try to use a Cartesian approach and subdivide that into the 3 areas. Firstly, how can we prepare and plan for crisis? Secondly, how do we handle the crisis, actually crisis management, and what do we do then in the post-crisis to cope best with? I think for the preparation of the crisis, I think it's important to remind ourselves, as we have learned from Dirk, that tourism is really a trust and belief product, or put differently, that it is associated with the need for peace of mind. And that hence, in order to move from tourism to sustainable tourism, as was said this morning, we need to inject the dimension of risk and crisis management. I think another point is that we've learned that tourism is in fact the first kind country, the first product that is suffering from crisis is a compressible. We've seen the big trade collapse that non-compressible products, would go on. Tourism is different. We've heard the example from the Pacific, 50% reduction. We've seen that in Tunisia, I understand that the first quarter 2011 has a 60% reduction in tourism. So this is a very major difficulty. We also learned as part of the preparation that long manuals are not writing, nobody has read them, and they are not being practiced. And we learned for the preparation phase that it is particularly important to develop a media response, to connect to the media, to the journalists, firstly, and second, perhaps more fundamentally, to integrate. Let me just see here. To integrate travel and tourism into the emergency structure, as Dirk said, which I think is a very important point. And here, the work of the UNWTO with the Tourism Response Network and the guide that you have been preparing, that's about to come out with a toolbox, is going to really facilitate the preparation, the anticipation of crisis. I think in the same line, I think the Egyptian experience of establishing the crisis fund, something that can be very useful. And at an even more practical level, to ensure that actors and major players in tourism have all the numbers of their staff, spokespersons, languages, and so on sorted out. So a very practical way of handling it. Now let's come to the immediate crisis management. And there, I think, in the same way as we've learned that long-term investment in shares nowadays are between 5 and 50 minutes, we are in a situation where you've been saying that there's no more time. Actually, there's an hour's time or so to react, which changes the entire situation. So, again, the key point in immediate crisis management is the management with the media. Key point here, tell the truth and give people permission to believe, very important. And the double point to the need to be in charge and need to appear to be in charge. I think both points are very, very important. Then the point that the importance of agreeing on messaging throughout the tourism response network, and to use the modern facilities, as you were saying, the media changing by the week and by the month, and use, for instance, internet television, use the most credible and up-to-date direct images and experiences during the crisis. I think I'm not going to repeat the content of the guide, but I thought that captures very well the different phases of the crisis management. The key point here was also that no crises are never the same, and I thought that here maybe two distinctions may be useful. The one distinction between the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns factors, and I think the known unknowns, for instance, changes in currencies, changes in political situation, and so on. This is one category, but I think, and there those of us who may have read Black Swans may be particularly stimulated by the idea of how to, after all, try to prepare for the unknown unknowns. Now, for the last point, the actual post-crisis, what can we do there? I think a number, again, of very important points. Firstly, a new notion of time, and the need to look in the short term, medium term, and long term. I think in the longer term, I thought was a very important point, the need for patience. It takes time to heal wounds. Then point never to try to solve your problems on your own. You help others, you're never alone. I thought one very point the moderators, the role of the social partners, which is important. It's still on the management side, the possibility to use word of mouth for creating again a new reality of what's happening, to have witnesses in terms of image and sound. Very interesting approach to use the crisis for training paid by government to avoid laying off people. And the importance of assisting companies, in particular by deferring payments, such as taxes. And to some extent, in some countries, it may be possible to replace some of the fallout in international tourism travel by some domestic tourism, but that is far from obvious for a number of structural reasons. Finally, as Martin noted here, a bank of good stories to be stimulating and to relaunch the demand. So, moderator, I tried to note the major thoughts, but I must say there was probably much more, and I was impressed of how much the panel and all of you participants have been able to put together. And I am sorry only that not more of the participants this morning had the privilege of joining you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frederick. I would like now, on behalf of Frederick and Dr. Faraji, to thanks very much and sincerely all the panelists for these excellent communications. I would like to thank all the participants of at this session. It's a very great opportunity for me to learn about tourism and to see the other side and how social dialogue, the social dimension of a post-crisis could be dealt in a particular sector. I would like to say the tourism sector. So this is an opportunity for us in ILO to reinforce our cooperation and collaboration with UNWTO and all the other organizations. So thank you very much and have a very pleasant conference. Thank you.